So I have a confession to make. And the confession is that when I first began talking to students in schools or student organizations like fraternities, when I would be invited in to talk to them about substance misuse and what I faced and what our family faced, I often avoided discussing marijuana. And here's why. Because the debate as we move toward many states and the federal government potentially one day, decriminalizing as they've done marijuana and, making it not a federal offense, and as many states look at making it legal. In that movement, I felt a little pressure that if I said something that might sound negative marijuana, that people might hate on me, so to speak. And I've seen some of that, frankly, in social media where they say, it's no different than alcohol. And I do not disagree. But I think there's a lot of education points about alcohol that we can and should have, just like trans fats and so many other things that are healthy or not healthy if used in excess. So finally, one day, I realized that I needed to stand up and speak the truth. And here's where that truth came from. We long have had the National Center for Natural Product Research at the University of Mississippi. And Dr. Megan Rosenthal, you made a connection for me because you work with many colleagues over there, and you said, hey, they may have some things to share with you. I reach out to them and what they share, because they've long been one of the only sites in the country sanctioned by the federal government to grow and study cannabis and THC, the ingredient that makes you high. And what they report is that since 1995, the potency of street marijuana in America has gone up drastically, nearly 400%. And when I heard that, it really helped me to start connecting dots of rising addiction, marijuana use disorder among young people, other issues faced. And I decided enough is enough. I got to get over myself. I can have a conversation about this logically without being against legal marijuana, I don't know what I always says. I don't know whether I'm for it or against it. The research will bear that out. Ultimately, whatever is healthiest for American families and individuals, if legal is it, I'm all for it, But right now, we still don't know that. I don't think. What we do know is that street marijuana potency has increased dramatically.
That's right. And I think, you always talk about this, David, and kind of the name of this is not your mother or your father's marijuana, right? And so I think about even when I was in high school, the potency had obviously increased because I was in high school after 96, but it wasn't even at that point kind of what it is today, right? And you think about, and you didn't hear, until the last 5 years, marijuana, the idea of marijuana use disorder, the running kind of convention at that point was, well, marijuana is not addictive and it's natural. It's totally fine. There's no negative consequences for that. But we're seeing that change dramatically, and the number of issues that young people and people in general are having as a consequence of that. And we've seen some of that, and again, I'm not for or against it, but you look to places that have legalized it across the country and around the world, you are seeing the fallout from maybe not having those careful conversations and not engaging in that education, and not really at this point, because it's relatively new, understanding all of the ins and outs of the impact that has on our bodies. And so we're in the midst of a real life experiment as we speak.
We are, Alexis Lee, in the midst of a real life experiment where, again, it's one of these issues that we talk about on this podcast so much. There's decent information there. There is good information, for example, that says high and repeated use of marijuana, chronic marijuana use to a young mind is very dangerous and damaging. And there's not even any gray area in there. But somehow in this country that was built on the back of education, we haven't done a very good job of getting that information to students that so they can make their own decisions. And I think that's what we have to do, figure out going forward, is figure out how do we have that conversation with them, A, without turning them off, B, without really being able to open their minds so they understand what's happening.
True, exactly what you just said. And I'm a perfect, I guess, lab rat in that way. And I've said this on the podcast before, I had no idea about marijuana till I started this job in this field, and have learned so much over the past couple months. And I don't blame anyone for that. It's kind of like, it was like this forbidden fruit before. No one wanted to talk about it, kind of hidden. But there's so much that we need to talk about to educate students, and we aren't going to tell them not to do it, just like we're not going to tell them not to do alcohol or drugs, but we need to give them the tools to make decisions themselves, to equip them to understand what's happening, and what's in it. It's not, it's natural, but what does that mean? How does that work in your body to understand, so that when they take it, they're not completely, or try it, they're not completely just down a rabbit hole.
So what's interesting is there's so much we don't understand, and we saw an increase in the drinking age many years ago in this country, and we've seen a correlation. Whether that's related or not, I don't know. But what I'm saying is we've seen a correlation at the same time of a rise in the use of marijuana of young people that has gone up pretty substantially. And in that rise has been an extension of how they use it. Typically, it used to just be smoked. Now it's often vaped. Now it's used in many ways that not only is the THC potency so much stronger, but it's used in ways that take more maximum potency from that THC. And therefore, a youth today that is chronically using street marijuana is likely getting, 4, 5, maybe 6 times or more, I'm told, of the potency and concentration of THC in their body on a daily basis than, say, the same teen would have gotten 20 years ago. Now, that's a drastic difference. That is a drastic difference. And we are now beginning to see the evidence, as you say, Megan. Now it's a common discussion where research is saying this is addictive, but we haven't quite gotten the information when I go tell that to students and parents, they act surprised. I'm telling you, I will talk to a room full of college-educated parents, and I tell them marijuana's addictive, and they're like, what? Are you sure? They're checking on their phones. Let me check this out. But the concept of drinking age, marijuana, again, I don't know if they're related, but I think that things are changing so fast and so drastically. At some point, we're going to have to try to unravel what is happening here.
Well, and I don't know. I don't have the answer to that either. That's the nature of the tricky thing about correlations is like they might be related, but they might not be. But it makes me start thinking about, because we haven't engaged with marijuana use culturally on a big scale, that we maybe don't understand we haven't had a big national conversation about what it looks like. We've had big national conversations about alcohol use, right? We have a long history in the United States of those kinds of conversations that led to prohibition, that led to all of these different kind of things in between, increasing, decreasing the drinking age, all of that. Because marijuana, like you said, Alexis, has been kind of behind closed doors, and like a certain kind of person used marijuana historically. Stigma for sure.
That's right.
Right? We've not done that with this yet on that kind of scale, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that parents don't know, because I certainly didn't know until very, very recently that it was addictive. And I wonder, and I don't, again, we'd have to look at this more closely, but I wonder if it's connected, this kind of we don't know is connected to the increase in use for our young people, because, well, we don't know, and it's natural, it's a plant, and we think plants are good, right? We are always after everybody, like, eat your greens and more vegetables and blah, 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 right? So it can't be bad for you. And then we also see, again, that parallel increase that we talked about before on this, on the mental health issues of our young people, and they're looking for solutions, because we're not really, until very recently, we haven't been talking about that either, right? And so we've kind of left our young people in limbo, so to speak. So we haven't had this big national conversation about marijuana use and its implications, and we haven't also had that same parallel conversation about mental health use. And so our young people are in the midst of, I'm feeling all these things, and I don't have a solution, and I'm not in a place where I can have that kind of conversation about either of those topics with my family or my parents or whomever. I don't feel like I can. maybe this is a solution.
And it's readily available.
And it's easy
it
to get.
changes how they feel. They're
Exactly.
anxious, they're depressed. And so they're looking for some remedy, and it's right there. It's affordable, it's available, it's accessible. And so here they go. So we're seeing a dramatic increase. But in that dramatic increase, and some studies show that some 20% of teens these days are using marijuana. Studies also show these days that 3 out of 10 of those students, I mean, not a small number, 3 out of 10 of those students are likely suffering from marijuana use disorder. So that's a very substantial number, which tells the tale of why when I'm in schools and I start speaking of this, they first start rolling their eyes, but then when I dig in and say, I just need you to hear me. I'm not telling you don't do this. You're in charge of you. Go do whatever you want to do. I just want you to have the information, and what you need to understand is you are putting something in your body on a daily basis that is much stronger than what you have been told culturally is happening, and it may not be as easy to walk away from as you think,
I think, David, you can speak to this better because you've talked about it a little bit, that when you talk to people and they think marijuana is just not this strong drug and not this strong thing, and there's no way should have to go to rehab for marijuana, but that's not always the case. But that's kind of what people have started to believe in a way.
Well, they do, but what's happened is we'll use an alcohol analogy. If in 1995 everybody was drinking light beers, they have now teenagers have now moved to the effective pure grain alcohol, right? which we were all afraid of. I mean, that's the analogy, and that's not mistaken. So, it for the young mind, the issue is, what I tell young people is your choice of what you want to do. But what I want for you is I want you to have your joy. And what we're seeing increasingly is young people, because for all the reasons you said, Megan, that they are falling in that trap. And then often they're down a road of, it hasn't solved anxiety. For many, it's probably caused more. It has created for them because even in a legal state, they're not old enough to buy it. So it has created with them a relationship with what I can only call a drug dealer, because they're illegal. They're being sold. And it is something that is altering their mind, probably, impeding their maturation of the brain and emotionally, and just really interrupting their life more than yet they can show up at family dinners and they can show up at school and nobody really knows for sure. Like, for example, if this were done by alcohol,
Right. And I think that the conversation that we're having here reminds me of something really important to think about, as it relates to what we know or don't know in the research literature right now, is that it's worth pointing out the research literature often lags substantially behind the reality of what people are facing in the world. And I think it's important to call that out, right? And one of the things that I love about the work we do with the Mayo Lab is that through your work, David, and the conversations you're having with our external communities and the conversations you have with students in high schools, we get a front row seat to what these young people are facing right now. And how do we start thinking about communicating not only with them, but with their families and with our larger communities in a way to say, good, bad, or otherwise, here's what we know right now. And how do we get you that information in a way that you can consume it and push the pause button for just a second to say, okay, is this a good idea for me? And is this going to give me the thing I ultimately want with my life or not? And then make the decision accordingly. But we're falling down in that regard at the research level, right? We're not engaging in those discussions. We're not listening carefully or even having conversations with people kind of in the external world in the same way that we should be, I think. And so we're inflicting a real life natural experiment on people, but not really thinking carefully about what the implications and consequences of that are going to be for them. And it kind of breaks my heart a little bit.
Well, it does, because when you think about it, let's say 9% of U.S. adults are chronically using marijuana, 20% of teens, for example. Those 20% of teens, that's risen, that's a new number, and they are undeniably having impact on their lives. And then that 20% of teens, as they become adults, it does move us into a different state as a state of well-being as a country, because it leaves us in a situation of perpetual medication for a large number, self-medication for a large number of people. And that, I think, is a larger question also, where it's not what I tell students. Like when I walk in, a student told me once to a school, he's like, I was afraid you were going to come in here and tell us don't do this, but I was glad you didn't. And I was like, I don't think I will ever say don't do this. But what I do think we need to increasingly help them understand, and parents, I had a parent call me last evening, for example, and she said, my child is really struggling and he's drowning in marijuana misuse. And at first I thought, well, he's a teen, I don't know what I can do about it, but it's gotten so severe that we've got to reach out and get some help and do something about it. And what the message for them, I think, for parents, she's saying, what could I have done? What can I do? And I think for starters, it's not about spending so much time trying to scare them about it or tell them, but I think it's just having honest conversations, maybe beginning in middle school, of, look, this is out there. Mm-hmm. It's a part of culture. You will undoubtedly face it. Here is what it, here's what it does to the mind. Here's why I hope you will delay use. So if the answer to parents that I always say is, if you can, try every tactic reasonably to work with them to delay, because the longer they can just avoid that use and let their brain mature, the better odds that it will not impact them later. That's why the work I think we can do working with schools is so vital, because if we can just convey that education, I mean, mm-hmm. young people are smart, mm-hmm. but they just need to know the facts. Then they can make their own decisions.
And I think kind of in combination with that too is this idea, and we talk a lot about this, in our not on air time, but the stigma of this, right? We think that still culturally, and this is so not true, it's a certain kind of person becomes an addict.
Yeah,
right. Like you have this certain vision of like, well, that could, somebody potentially on a street corner or looking disheveled or doing, right. You guys can conjure all of this in your minds. So certainly it wouldn't be my kid, right? Couldn't possibly. We have all of the things and we have a good life and I do good things. But that's not how any of this works, right? That's the sinister part of substance misuse, is that it's not somebody else. It could absolutely be you and people in your family and, your extended friend network and all of those different kinds of things. And so for parents to start thinking through and making the recognition that, yeah, it could be my kid. And then having that conversation with them, like you said, David, about what this does and what this looks like and how to avoid it, and not feel peer pressure to start using it and doing all of these different kinds of things. It starts with us to have that frank conversation from a place of not trying to scare the pants off them to not do it, right? But that's really hard, really hard.
You make a great point about the stigma, because I'll be honest, I get this from parents more times than I'm comfortable with. The truth is, it's easy for some people to look at different neighborhoods, lower economic strata, and think, well, that's their problem. They're the ones who are just sitting around smoking weed all the time. And I actually see what I'll call some suburban judgment of when I have a parent, and it happens often, whose child is suffering from marijuana use disorder. They just don't want to admit that and face that. And they will come up with any reason for their child to go get treatment except for marijuana use disorder, because they think that is beneath them. I have to tell you. So what we need, I think, is we really need to take the stigma out of marijuana in general, so that therefore we can begin to have an honest conversation about the pros and cons. Okay, sure, there's some medical benefits over here, and here's what it does to a young developing mind. So the stigma is a big issue, and I encounter that more than I like, and I try to push back against it. I say, look, This can impact everybody and does. Your family is no different. Your student or teen is no different, but that doesn't make them feel better. They'll go, oh, okay, I know, but like, let's not label it that. I'll have one change the language and go, maybe we'll go for nicotine addiction, or maybe we'll say they've been drinking too much. I'm like, yeah, well, they're barely drinking at all. I mean, I think that it's important for them to deal with and face where they have some chronic misuse. And the stigma is so critical. So perhaps, that's the one upside as we move toward a larger national conversation. But it's just not black and white. In the pushing for legality, it's not as simple as this is fine. It's that maybe there's good arguments for it to be legal. It's just not so black and white because the data is clear. It's not just fine. The same as too much sugar or too much refined flour or too much alcohol or tobacco or anything else. And we can't be afraid to have that conversation with parents, with students, to begin to delve into how is this impacting me? And if I use it daily, what is it going to do to me?
That's right. And I think that, in addition to what you're saying there is this, and this is like a larger idea that we come back to, in our conversations in the office and as part of this series in the podcast, is that it's not black and white. And that sucks, right?
Be a lot easier.
How much easier would it be if it was just like right or wrong? But it's not. And so how do we, and one of the things I really hope we can do with the Mayo Lab and do with our larger work at the Institute is think through how do we get people comfortable with the fact that it's not black and white? And what does that look like, right? And how do we have those discussions with our young people and our families and our larger communities? I mean, I was right there with you, David, as you started talking about the fact that maybe the side benefit of legalization conversation is that the stigma attached to it goes away. Right? That's a benefit.
That is
certainly
a benefit, for sure.
But it will come hand in hand with possibly an increase, a substantial increase in the negative consequences of using it. But if it gets us more people into treatment, then all the better who need it, right? But how do we get comfortable with this idea that nothing is one or the other? It's always something in between. And what that something in between is varies day to day, week to week, person to person, time to time.
Exactly right.
But we, as human beings, don't want to have those feelings all the time. And so how do we work at getting comfortable with that? I don't have the answer to that. It's something I certainly struggle with, every day of my life. But I think that's worthy conversation for us to delve more deeply into.
And I think the only answer I have is that we know education works, and young people just need the information. Like what we just have done a very good job at teaching them how to read and write and math. And I think a lot of people would argue we need to do better. We need to do better. But by and large, our country has expanded and flourished for many decades due to education. But yet I don't go in any school in the country really that tackles this. Frankly, even in this movement, as we talk about the stigma, schools are really scared of that conversation because it even as it becomes more mainstream, like just as I came on the beginning of this episode and said, I'll be honest, I used to avoid this conversation because I didn't want people saying, oh, well, clearly you're anti-marijuana, legal, this, that, and there is some of that I've gotten. But I say, but you're wrong. I might be the opposite once I have all the information, but all I'm about is about young people having the information. And it comes back to social media. It comes back to counterfeit pills. It comes back to how do they manage their emotions. That has to become a part of curriculum in some way or another if we're really to move forward in this country as a healthy generation.
I think what's so great about this podcast is our goal is to start a different conversation. And that's exactly what we need to do in this space. And it's with the students for sure. It's also with families, like we were talking about earlier, of vulnerability breeds vulnerability. And so when parents are able to kind of take that out of their minds, stigma, and open up a space for their students to have these conversations, the students, I feel, will feel more of a safe space. Like Megan was saying earlier, like I'm having these mental health issues and I don't want to talk about marijuana with my parents. Like, so there's just in this like no man's land of just creating and fostering a safe space for families to have these conversations through educating both the parents and the students to do that. And just, I think also from observation, the students, if they are struggling, feel they're already ashamed.
Right.
But they know their parents are also ashamed of them or for them. It's almost like a double up that it makes it that much harder for them to speak out and speak up when they feel that.
There's no doubt about it. And that's why, indeed, we are starting a new conversation, a different conversation. We appreciate you joining us on the Mayo Lab podcast. I'm David McGee for Alexis Lee and Dr. Megan Rosenthal. Come back and see us next time and tell others about it.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Mayo Lab podcast. The Mayo Lab podcast is produced by Dr. Natasha Jeter, Dr. Megan Rosenthal, David McGee, Alexis Lee, and Slade Lewis. This podcast was recorded at Broadcast Studio in Oxford, Mississippi. The show was mixed and mastered by Clay Jones, and our original music was composed by Slade Lewis. The Mayo Lab podcast is brought to you by the William McGee Institute for Student Wellbeing. For more information on the Mayo Lab, head over to themayolab.com and follow us on social media at the Mayo Lab. If you enjoyed listening to the Mayo Lab podcast with David McGee, we need your help. Tell others about it. And we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of David McGee and guests of the show. This podcast is not intended to be a substitute for the medical advice of a licensed counselor or physician. The listener should consult with their mental health professional in any matters relating to his or her health or the health of a child.